With all the news surrounding Diablo 4, there's been a lot of discourse online. But after sitting down and thinking about it for quite a long time, to be honest, I realized just throwing out an opinion piece here wouldn't really do anybody justice. So what I think I'd rather do here is touch on a lot of the points I see people making and just discuss a lot of the concepts. Here's what Diablo 2 players should expect walking into Diablo 4. Just so we understand the anatomy, I'm going to put the thing from Diablo 2 on top and the thing from Diablo 4 on the bottom. And the first one that we're talking here is the difference between game lobby and open world. So let's start off with the fact that, as far as I can tell, Diablo 4 is going to be a purely online game. So just the idea of being able to play single player without internet versus playing on Battle.net. That doesn't mean that you can't play solo self-found, and I don't know what they're going to do to support solo self-found going forward. It's a very popular thing in ARPGs, and I would expect it to be supported in this space in some way, shape, or form. But what we're talking about here is an online experience. So we're talking about the game lobby experience versus an open world. In Diablo 2, it's pretty simple. You either make a private game or a public game. If it's a public game, anyone can join. Having more people in the game is going to impact how much experience you get, how hard a monster is going to be to kill and how much damage they do, and how many items drop. From what we've been told by the developers, one, everybody is logging into the same world. There aren't going to be regions that you need to log into, i.e. you don't need to log into North America versus Europe versus Asia. Because of this, you can expect to find other players running around in the open world as well. And while I'm just summarizing here, the basic consensus was, yes, you should be running into players out in the open world, but in places that make sense. So when you're in a hub area like a city, so Kyovashad is the city that a lot of people have been getting their hands on. When you are running around, you might see a couple other players running around as well. It helps the world to feel lived in, but also these other players weren't negatively impacting you in some way. They weren't going to the shop and buying a wand or a piece of armor that you won't be able to buy then. Each player's experience in the game is pretty singular, it's pretty isolated, but you will see those other characters out there. While everybody is in the same world, how many people are in basically your version of the world or your instance of the world is going to be more limited. While the exact numbers don't exist right now, what it basically comes down to is, let's say there's 1,000 people logged into Diablo 4, you're probably only going to have somewhere between 10 to 50 people in your version of the world. This means that there are multiple versions of the world, all supporting players, all supporting monsters spawning and loot being generated, but you're not going to show up to a quest area and not be able to kill anything because there's 1,000 other people. I'm probably going to end up comparing a lot of this to World of Warcraft, but you all know what I'm talking about. Down in Menethil Harbor, trying to sit there and kill murlocs, but everybody else is hyper farming the same area. It sucked. Luckily, in Diablo 4, you're really not going to get that oversaturation of people. While you are going to see other players in the world, you're not somehow now inundated with this nexus of thousands and thousands of other players like you might have seen in some MMOs in the past. I'm looking at you, Tibia and EverQuest. Now that being said, in the open world, there are events that a lot of people are going to congregate to. You have the world boss events. These were giant fights where upwards of like 10 to 30 people at any given time were all fighting the world boss at the same time. All the world bosses are constructed so that their AoE effects and the various things that you need to know to be able to survive the fight make it so that being swarmed by a bunch of players doesn't trivialize it. While monsters will scale to how many people are in your party and in the area around you, a person randomly running by you in the open world isn't going to somehow make the demon that you're fighting just do more damage because they're not actively participating in that fight. When you go into a dungeon, other characters aren't able to just walk into the dungeon that you happen to be in. All of those are instanced. When you actually join a group, it will ask you, do you want to enter that player's instance of the world? This means that you're going to be tied to whatever monsters they're killing, you're going to be able to see them, you're going to be able to ping them, and then be able to go and do closed instance content like dungeons together with them as well. But hey Mac, once I'm in that dungeon with my other friends, what happens to the loot that drops? This is going to be the biggest departure from Diablo 2. The idea in Diablo 2 is that it's free for all loot. Having more players in the game means that more items drop, but you also need to be able to literally click faster and teleport at higher frames to be able to get good drops, or just get lucky and be standing near it when it happens. Everybody loves that one person who opens up a town portal right on top of Diablo right before he dies so that their auto clicker can pick up the gear that you want, and when you try to spam click, you end up just going back to the town. Slash sarcasm there in case it wasn't completely obvious. In Diablo 4, you're gonna have smart loot. If you help to kill a thing and it drops an item, it drops an item for everybody. Not only that, it's going to drop an item that you specifically can use. It's a weapon that your class type can use. It's going to have plus skills equal to your class type skills, etc., etc. Now, from what I could see, this doesn't mean that if it drops a breastplate, it just drops a different type of breastplate per character that was in the group, but more so just means if loot is dropping, everybody's getting their own rolls of loot. Now, if that's just something you don't personally like, I get it. Everybody has tastes. But let's talk about the fact that in this Diablo game, if you play for an hour, you're gonna get loot equal to having played for an hour. If you just so happen not to be able to click as fast as somebody else, you're not gonna get robbed of any GG gear. And while we'll get more into it later, the value of each piece of gear that you drop is going to increase with your character progression as well. So you're not going to be a level 99 character killing Diablo for the umpteenth millionth time just to drop a Lenimo sash. Let's say you're playing in a group with friends. You're the person who has a couple kids, you have a full-time job, you're not able to play as much, but you also want to be experiencing this game with your buddies who happen to have more free time. When the boss drops loot, you get to get loot too. All you have to do is manage to stay alive long enough to pick it up or get revived by one of your friends. But you're not now getting penalized if your particular class has less mobility than another one, or if your auto clicker happens to be broken on that day. Again, just slash sarcasm. I don't use an auto clicker, but you know who I'm talking about. I was just going to include it all here, but let's actually move on to the next concept, which revolves around how economy will work in a game with smart loot. This one's going to be a little bit harder to really unravel, but let's just in general try to dissect how item value theoretically could work between these two games. In D2, let's say you hit a terror zone and all of a sudden you're farming level 99 Chaos Sanctuary. Kill Diablo, you could be dropping random gear, completely random gear. Heck, you might get a pair of Hotspurs that are like super cool and might fill a particular niche of your build. You might also just get your 8,000th Saigon shield and leave it on the floor. You pick up a rare ring. It's got a bunch of stats that your character doesn't necessarily use a lot of, but you've seen on Charcy Food and on Reddit that it might be valuable, so you gotta go hit that up and post price check, price check. What items you could expect to get in Diablo 2 was a huge gamble. Let's be abundantly clear, I loved it. I love hitting the slot machines every single time that I kill a monster, but it required a level of game knowledge that was just completely inaccessible to anybody who hadn't played about 10,000 hours in Diablo 2. But let's talk about how item generation will work in D4, at least from what we've seen. If your character levels up, monsters scale with you. Likewise, the items that you drop also scale with your level. So basically, if you were to pick up a rare helmet at a really low level, it might have plus to a couple of your base stats, it might have a plus to skill, and it might have some resistances on it. If you were to pick up that exact same hat, but 25 levels later, you're going to see 25 levels of progression of power on the gear. It's going to be able to roll higher stats, to be able to roll more resistances. It's going to add more plus skills. On top of that, from what we were able to see in the press release and then what we can intuit from a lot of the other information that was available in the game, the rarity of items. So what am I talking about here? Common, magic, rare, legendary, unique. These are all of the rarities of items. There's no set pieces, so the people who don't like that from Diablo 3, there you go. You don't have to worry about getting the set that basically defines your whole build. There aren't rune words, so people who dislike the fact that rune words are never really balanced, the cost efficiency of different rune words were absolutely off of the charts. They don't exist either. As you get higher level, the average rarity of item that you drop tends to get higher. By the time I hit level 25, I was able to be dropping legendary pieces of gear. A legendary piece of gear is a rare piece of gear that has a legendary aspect. Legendary aspect is a cool power that is going to alter your character in a more significant way than just skills. To give you an example of one, I found a legendary axe on my barbarian that said when I use a basic skill, so your generator skill from the first node of your skill tree, if you haven't seen my skill tree video, I'll link it here. When I used those skills, my attack animation was 30% faster. And this isn't a secret breakpoint type of thing. It was the animation took 30% less time to finish. That's cool. I found a good weapon with good stats that also made it so that my generator skills, which I need to use my more powerful skills, is now faster. Sick. So if you're more likely to find rare pieces, which are able to turn into legendary pieces, or legendary pieces and theoretically unique items as well, as you progress through the game, the gear that you find is going to be of higher quality. And I said I was going to touch on economy here, so let me explain this part too. You're able to trade rare items. A rare item is going to be the base item that you're going to craft into your best in slot gear unless you're using a unique item in that slot. So let's say I found a really crappy legendary item that had an awesome aspect. I can extract that and put it into a piece of rare gear. Now that it's a legendary item, I can upgrade it to the maximum benefit. This will increase all the stats on it. I could go and enchant it, which is taking a single affix roll, a single stat on it, and trying to re-roll it to get the perfect stat in that slot. I could take this piece of gear and then socket it and then put the gems in that I need for the stats that I want. When you drop a random rare item, it really isn't going to be that random. The item is going to be relevant to your class, so you're going to understand how valuable it is to your class. Oh, this weapon just so happens to have a lot of critical strike damage and critical strike chance, as well as overpower damage. The average DPS on it is very high and it's a fast weapon. I know that this is valuable. I know that it's a good weapon, but I don't personally need it. So when I go to trade this item, I'm going to have an approximate evaluation of how valuable it will be. Now, that being said, the player base is going to have to determine just how valuable gold is to then determine the trade values of items, but you're not going to be stuck wondering, is this a good piece of gear? You're going to know because it's going to be based to your class. Let's say it rolled a bunch of perfect stats, but it's for a skill that you don't use. Perfect. Go ahead and trade that over to the other barbarian that happens to be using whirlwind. Get your gold and use that to trade into weapons and gear that you know is beneficial for your class. You're not going to need to stockpile rares and legendaries of lower item tier because you know that you're going to be eventually finding sacred and ancestral versions of that same gear. So the stat rolls are just going to be higher. Just again, the big takeaway here is that in Diablo 2, you might be sitting on a ton of like amazing pieces of gear that you just don't know and end up rotting on a character because you're too afraid to throw anything away. Versus in Diablo 4, it's kind of streamlined. If you get a really good rare item, hold on to it to trade it. But if it's too low level, go ahead and toss it or salvage it. You really don't need to be holding on to every single piece of gear that you find because you're paralyzed by not knowing its relative value. This one's a little bit harder to explain, but please stick it out with me. There's been a lot of talk about the aesthetic of Diablo 4, the aesthetic of previous Diablos, the atmosphere. But I think one of the criticisms of Diablo 3, and we'll get back to Diablo 2, but I think one of the criticisms of Diablo 3 is it went in a World of Warcraft kind of artistic, stylistic design place. And I think that's true. It's brighter, it's flashier, it's a bit more cartoony. I like it. I think it has a good look. I think the game is very pretty. But I also agree that when you see people in really high level greater rifts mashing a bunch of monsters together with a million particle effects going off, it's just difficult to understand what's happening because we have to remember where we came from. In Diablo 1, the graphics in the game engine literally could not support the number of particle effects that you would see in Diablo 3. It was dark. You could almost feel the walls dripping with malice, mildew, and rot. Monsters were scary looking. They were legitimately terrifying to look on back then. Walking into the butcher's room was traumatizing. And that really paved the way for what we came to expect from the Diablo franchise. I think Diablo 2 did a great job in trying to capture that again. The game was beautiful. I loved it in its original graphics. And in Diablo 2 Resurrected, I think that they have truly mastered what the game could and should have looked like the entire time once we bring it back up to modern standards. But even in Diablo 2 and in Diablo 2 Resurrected, the game didn't really capture that heinous, brooding darkness of Diablo 1. It was lighter, able to show more details in graphics, which meant that my brain was filling in less of the gaps. It went closer to a fantasy as opposed to a gothic fantasy aesthetic. I think that Diablo 4 is legitimately the first game in the franchise to actually capture the feel, the aesthetic, and the dread of Diablo 1. This game is heinous. It is legitimately terrifying to be playing in the game. Now, as you get used to it, obviously that crumbles away and you're just playing the game and you're dealing with the mechanics, but the cutscenes are heinous. The storyline that it's showing right now is the darkest storyline I've ever seen in a Diablo game. And literally walking through the world feels like walking through what my Americanized history brain has been taught walking through feudal Europe must have felt like. The streets are overridden with people barely scraping by for a meal. While the merchant class seems to be doing pretty good, the average citizen walking around is either blindly following the faith of the church or has become completely disillusioned to it all and realizes that they're on the precipice of disaster. Walking into dungeons, you can't see anything. It's barely lit by sconces that are all but burnt out. The monsters lurking in each area aren't blown up like Christmas trees. When you open that door, that's gonna be your first clue of what's around the corner coming to kill you. If you're somebody who played Diablo 2 and you got turned off by Diablo 3's aesthetic, Diablo 4 is about to slap you in the face with what your nostalgia thinks the aesthetic used to look like. To quote my new YouTube persona obsession of Jarvis Johnson, always be plugging, if you haven't seen my skill tree video where I break down how skill trees are going to work in Diablo 4, I really recommend checking it out, because I don't think that what we've learned from the different quarterly updates really does justice to just how awesome the skill tree system is, and I am impressed with how well constructed it is and how impactful my decisions felt every time I put in a skill point. In Diablo 2, you have a skill tree, and we like to think about this idea of being able to customize your build, picking any skills you want, only putting 10 points into here and 20 points into there, being able to mix and match everything that you want. You want to be a tri-elemental sorceress? Here's how you do it. You want to be a barbarian that uses every weapon type? Here's how you do it. You want to be an Amazon that uses a spear and javelins and also has a bow setup but uses a ton of passives? Here you go. Here's how you do it. Yeah, that's just not actually true. Now, don't get me wrong. Everybody loves a meme lord. You can do whatever you want, 1 point in every skill. It's what you did as a kid, and heck, you almost barely beat Diablo in normal difficulty. But here's the reality about skill trees with synergies in Diablo 2. You pick the primary skill that you're going to use, you pick how much damage it needs to do, you then input that many points into synergies. You then pick up the utility skills that you're going to use or mobility skills that you're going to use. And then if you're on low gear, you probably pick up a second element for your build to deal damage with until you inevitably respec into the perfect blizzard sorceress. Or you realize that a lot of skills are 1-point wonders, so they're effectively an entire build without needing to put any other points in. Looking at you, Smiter. And then you just build a full Fist of Heavens or Hammered In on top of that, and then just do everything in the game. And there's nothing wrong with that. Let's talk about Diablo 4's skill tree. In my video, I detailed a couple things, so I'm going to use those similar examples. You have a resource generating skill. This is going to be an attack that typically has some type of utility or added bonus that's going to set you up to use very powerful skills later on. Then you have your core skills. These are your spenders. You built up a bunch of resource. Now you get to use a more powerful ability that is going to use up that resource. So you have to manage the difference between generating resource and using resource. So already we have more nuance just between two skills and the enhancements that you choose for them than almost any other combination that you'd ever find in Diablo 2. I'm not saying that is a good or bad thing, but this is a difference. If you just like holding down left click until you hold down right click, do you, King Queen? That's fantastic. I also just like being able to hold down left click and murder everything on the screen. But when we're talking about Diablo 4, so now we get down into skills that are neither a generator or a spender. You just have big cooldown effects that bring to light some other nuance of your character. For the barbarian, this was something called Death Blow. Death Blow is sick. It does a ton of damage, and if you kill a monster with it, you get to do it again without waiting for its cooldown. So what this meant is I had my generator, which was Lunging Strike. It would bring me into combat. I use Whirlwind, which is going to damage all the monsters around me. And then when everything was at a life total that I knew Death Blow would proc on, I just sit there and hammer on Death Blow. Death Blow 1, automatic reset, Death Blow another, automatic reset, Death Blow another, etc., etc. Oh, and in between weaving my spender and my generator and then using my cooldown finisher, I have buffs, different shouts. These were giving me different buffs. Mobility for moving between packs, additional survivability with extra defensives, increasing my damage dealt to monsters and decreasing the damage that they do to me. So walking into a boss fight, I knew to have that damage proc up right before it used one of its big AoE attacks. Use the extra mobility to move out of the way of scripted attacks that the monsters had, buff up my survivability if it looks like I'm not able to get out of the way of a particular attack, and then weaving in the use of my big cooldown ability, which wasn't going to automatically reset because I wasn't going to kill the boss, but it adds to my DPS, making sure that whenever I move out of the way of an attack, rather than just walk back, I use my Lunging Strike to immediately move towards them, then hit them with my spender to put out the maximum DPS possible. So this is what I mean by a synergistic skill tree. The skills that you pick should synergize together. They should literally enable you to use the other ones when it makes sense to get the greatest effect out of it. And this is before we even talk about legendary aspects, which could have massive changes to your build style and skill rotation. This is just the base skills. I haven't even talked about Paragon, mostly because we weren't able to play with it, but that goes even further to modify all of this. This is just the base skill tree itself. Diablo 4 is a new game. It has a lot of DNA from the previous games. It's also a modern ARPG, so you're going to be seeing a lot of the things you've been seeing in other modern ARPGs in this game. I'm excited for Diablo 4. I'm excited for all the things that are different and new. I'm excited for us as a community to come together, play it, unlock all of the secrets, do all of the deep digging on how the calculations work. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.